Sam, thank you once again for being here to deliver this lecture series, because it really just gives us such a great cultural context to what we're stitching in Wagga. So I am going to hand over to you now. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be back again for Silk Inroads, and a great honour to be speaking today from the land of the Wiradjuri people, whose elders I acknowledge and extend respect to, and I also extend that respect to the elders of all the nations from whom our audience is joining us today, which includes, I note, friends from Coffs Harbour and the United States of America, from Canada, from Egypt, from New Zealand. It's wonderful to see such a great international diversity of interest in the history of the Silk Roads, which are, of course, one of the greatest international stories of our history. So I'm going to begin by sharing our screen now, or my screen. Here we go. And Natalie, not if you can see this correctly. Fantastic. Now, we are beginning, as we have, by continuing a story. Last time we spoke, we were speaking of the history of the Silk Roads and the idea and mythology of this region. This time we are honing in on 4 sites of great significance, because they are the sites that we are stitching together. All great stories begin with a map. So I think this helps to contextualize the Silk Roads at a glance, stretching from Istanbul in the far west, in this case, through towards China and Myanmar in the east, and noticing the 4 starred areas. The Shah-i-Zinda that we will begin with today in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. We will then move south into the northern parts of Afghanistan as we look at the Mazar-i-Sharif, then far west to the Jama Masjid, the great mosque of Isfahan. We will finish today's journey in the Taj Mahal, because that seems like a very good place to meet at the end of a long voyage. So from this point, these are the sites again more specifically, and I just wish to compare these by noting what they actually are. They are all known today as hugely significant heritage sites and cultural spaces of value to living communities, pilgrims and tourists alike. They are sites of faith and history and political manifestations of power. What we are seeing are also shrines to saints and venerated individuals. They are therefore mausolea, places in which the body is interred, unlike a cenotaph where the site is marked with a symbolic structure, but the body may be absent. These are places of burial. We are also looking at the idea of congregational mosques, which are not necessarily the same things as mausolea. They are separate entities. And of course, as we are building this together, we are sewing this together. More than 70 participants in Wagga Wagga are have been gradually stitching these extraordinary sites in small glimpses in needlepoint. So as this lecture progresses, we will see a few of these. Not all, sadly, because there are more than 70 and they would not all fit in the lecture, but trust me, they are all stunning and they will appear together in the Wagga Wagga Art Gallery later this year. Oops, pardon me. And this is an example of one. Indeed, this is a collaborative piece by both Penny Wright and Robin Kane, adapted from the Friday Mosque, a congregational mosque in Herat, Afghanistan. As we consider the intricacy of the needlepoint process, we are also seeing the luster of individual shine of the fabrics being used, the complexity of different stitches and different colors accordingly, which evokes the way the sun glistens upon these glazed tiles. And as we move through, I'm just giving you one example now to set the scene for our community arts project and why this lecture thus exists. But there's also a reason why I've been chosen to give the lecture, and this is my CV. It's always recommended that you add "I can bake" at the end of your CV somewhere, and this is a ginger texture inspired by the Shah-i-Zinda, which I made back in 2019. It's not one specific site, rather a caricature of an important complex in a singular form, noting that the actual text written upon this by its interned an architect, Alim Nasafi, included the text, "There is nothing man can build which will not vanish." And indeed, this vanished within 48 hours. But when we are looking at this site and thinking about creative translation, let's take us now to the original. The Shah-i-Zinda is a hillside necropolis. It grows over the climbing points of a hill with a series of stairways linking between alleyways and closed corridors with sites adjoining each other as a complex topography of cemeteries. When we are seeing the Shah-i-Zinda here, we are focusing upon the 20 or so very major structures, the mausolea and shrines which were built around the bodies of saints and venerated individuals from history of the region who chose to be interred here as it became an increasingly significant site. It is also an active cemetery for people to this day, with much smaller tombs and gravestones marking these locations. But the important thing to note about this being a city of the dead, necropolis, is that it survived as an architectural site, an archaeological site, by not being within the center of a living city. It was preserved as a space for visiting, for veneration, for respecting individuals. There are a number of practices within Islam that generate barakat, the idea of being blessed, and visiting the site of a saint was contested as an element of bringing barakat. It was not always seen the same way, but visiting as a pilgrim was an important site, particularly for those of Shia Islam. What we are seeing here, of course, is a recognition of one of the first and most important of these areas. The Shah-i-Zinda literally means the living king. This living king was Qutham ibn Abbas. Qutham ibn Abbas was a descendant or relative of the Prophet Muhammad, in the central figure of Islam. And as a result of his being a cousin and son-in-law, he was seen as being very close to the Prophet. It was alleged that when he was executed in this site, he was martyred for his cause, he was decapitated. The legend goes that he survived this process, held his head in his hands and leapt down a well. And thus he lives in a paradisical garden at the base of this well and to this very day. So the tomb of the living king sounds like a paradox, and of course it is, but this is part of the faith of the region and part of the pilgrimage justification for this site. Since then, members of the families and extended other significant people within the city that formed near this site, Samarkand, a great site of intellectual history and learning, have been interred in this region. It was visited and praised by Ibn Battuta, the great travel writer I mentioned in our last lecture, and many, many others since then. And of course, as we are looking at the kinds of work we are doing with our community project now, engaging with the history of this site by dealing with very small elements of the complex whole, we can see the use of calligraphy in a thuluth form, which means 1/3 in Arabic, a particular ratio of long form Arabic calligraphy here being evoked by Lorraine McMurray, Shah-i-Zinda Blues. And of course, if you look carefully enough at these photographs, you may just find the site it came from. We were careful, however, never to include complete words in calligraphy in case we are moving beyond a cultural respectful use of the site. Instead, here we are trying to capture the complexity of these sites and respect for the art form as its intricacy is translated one stitch at a time, an act which is almost reverential in its slowness and the careful attention to detail. Libby Donnellan's Uzbekistan Shartak references the four-square garden, the Char-i-Bar, which is something that we will see later on when we look at the Taj Mahal and other sites. You can see this again in the original setting, noting that the tiles themselves have transformed over time, and in their location, every tile is unique and distinctive to itself in this particular method. But as we move through these sites, the Shah-i-Zinda is a complex of multiple tombs, as we said before. Walking through it is like being transported to another world. And that, of course, was the intention. These are paradisical. The reason we see so many floriated forms is to evoke the idea of a superb divine garden. We also see calligraphy being positioned in place, which is like the amplification of the human voice to a more divine level, to see it spelled out in such a stunning physical form as words. But when we are seeing these, remember that each of these is a site significant to an individual. And over time, other graves have been added to mausolea when the families required this to be done. I'm going to hone in on one particular corner, which is the one behind me right now in my supposed office here in Zoom. As we are looking at this tile, I would like us to notice how these tiles are assembled. This is a cut tile technique, a format where each piece is separately crafted and fitted into a tessellation of complex shapes. We are seeing this, of course, evoked by Sue Wilson in her stitching Precious Bloom. But when we look to the original tile formats, we can see how Sue Wilson has quoted the creation of the original with these subtle white lines that evoke the gaps between the tiles themselves. Here we go. So as we are seeing the cracks and shifts within the shapes, we are reminded that the effect of these tiles is to be seen effectively at arm's length or even further away. We are to be enraptured in a grandeur of space, a transformative experience from the everyday to something that was luxurious but presented for public view out in an external facing room. The use of cut tile ceramic techniques is characteristic of much of this earlier work. It was replaced, however, as a technological development in something which is known as the haftarangi technique in Persian. Haftarangi is literally 7 colors, and the 7 color technique meant you could present a more evenly tessellated tile, more like a grid format as we see here, with a pattern which was then painted on the tile. And indeed, this pattern could be established with a wax resist technique. You may, as textile aficionados, be familiar with wax resist textiles like batik, for example. These, however, work with a method that's also familiar to the tent makers of Cairo, poncing, where you place a piece of paper upon the ceramic, you then draw the shape which you wish to evoke, and you thus create a tracing within the clay or a marking on the clay. This marking was thus followed with a piece of cord noted in wet wax, which then creates a wax resist on particular areas of the tile. That acts as a border for the glaze, holding it in place without needing to cut separate tiles. Now, this was, of course, later on known by the Spanish technique, cuerda seca, the dry cord technique. But they were, of course, in the craftsman's eyes, haftarangi. You may, if you're also particularly observant, have noticed that this tile is not from the Shah-i-Zinda. This is a Turkish tile. This is from further to the west, technically from the, again, deeply spiritually significant site of Konya in Turkey, the Mevlana Tobesi, or the tomb of the poet and thinker and philosopher Rumi. This is important because many sources attribute the Persian use of the haftarangi technique to an earlier innovation in Turkish tiles, thus reminding us that the Silk Road is a space for exchange and transformation across time and geography. But moving to another site within the Shah-i-Zinda, the mausoleum of Alim Nasafi, you might remember his quote on my gingertecture earlier. What we are seeing here is another array of unique patterns and formations which mark the different generations that have contributed to the Shah-i-Zinda over time and still do to this day. When we are looking at this site, if you look very carefully, you may realize that some of these patterns are geometric. Others are more perhaps arabesque, to use a term which is not usually used very often by historians of Islamic art. Arabesque being a French word to describe a pattern more accurately known by its craftsmen by different names, including Islami and other formats. But when we are looking at this complex entourage, I'm hoping to note 2 things in particular. The first is that white space, conspicuously absent of color and other ornament. These forms are known as mukhanas, and we will come to that mukhanas concept again in a few moments. But I also wish to call your attention to a repeating combination of patterns, highlighted just there at the bottom. We're about to zoom in on that one. Again, it transforms at close range, don't they? What we are seeing here is the importance of square Kufic calligraphy. I mentioned when our first slides earlier, the Shah-i-Zinda was Thuluth calligraphy, the 1/3 ratio, which is a flowing luminous line that lineates across an organic weaving form. However, this is more of a pixelated form. This consists of right angles being used strategically. And it's a particularly important format in both manuscripts and architecture because it lends itself beautifully to brickwork, amongst other things, the square format. What we are seeing here are terms which Natalie and I specifically avoided using in any of the stitching that we have worked on, and you are also working on in our Silk Inroads project together. These include, of course, the word Allah, which is literally God. It does not mean the Islamic God. It is simply the Arabic word for God. Being a monotheistic religion, it is the same entity. When we are moving from here, the next most common term, Muhammad, the prophet central to Islam. His name is evoked frequently and often in combination with the word Allah, for Muhammad is seen as the messenger of God. Then Ali, a significant figure to Islam as a whole, but also a divisive one. The fourth of the rightly guided caliphs, Ali was the figure responsible for a subsequent schism between Sunni and Shia Islam. Sunni Islam is very widespread globally. It is a more large population internationally, but Shia Islam is the form which is most typical in Iran and the Persianate states. So in Persianate regions, Ali has a particularly significant presence in public spaces and religious sites. And I mentioned earlier, Muqarnas. This is the spelling of the word, just in case it helps. Muqarnas is also the name of one of the leading journals of Islamic art and architecture for peer-reviewed scholars. But the Muqarnas is technically a kind of quarter dome. It's not really an accurate way of describing it. Muqarnas is a better word, but you'll see here it's a bit like what some people would call a squinch. It is a system for joining and bridging space with a fraction of a dome that thus enables an accumulation of these sites, like a series of hands stacked upon each other, which thus gives support to a much larger dome structure. The Muqarnas is a distinctive contribution seen in Islamic architecture. And when you find it in other places, it is usually an indication of some degree of correlation and collaboration between architects from one faith and practitioners from another region. And these are the domes they uphold. The dome inside, in this case, the mausoleum of Shah-i-Zinda. So what we are seeing here is a combination of both the inner glazed tiles of brickwork, as well as the more elaborately cut tiles and tessellated formats, which together uphold a sky evocative of the geometric formation of the universe at large. These are enormously diverse interior spaces, and they are often as individual as the people buried within these sites. A dome does not normally repeat a pattern in another site. They are typically respecting to the individual themselves. And as you can see here, there are a number of ways of building a dome. I feel that the external spaces should never be overlooked when you're considering the craft of these structures. We, of course, are looking closely at the ceramics in our needlepoint projects, but when we are considering the physical problem of building a dome that supports its own weight, including the weight of additional tiles inside or externally, we are seeing a variety of very consistent problem-solving measures, which include a variety of different solutions. And you'll note as well that the sides of the walls that are not facing the pilgrims are not necessarily decorated. Such extravagance was dependent upon which way the pilgrims would approach, which informs the design of subsequent buildings. I also think here we should remember that not all the tiles we see in the Shah-i-Zinda are original. They have been extensively restored in the post-Soviet era from the 1980s onwards, and this is not necessarily done for the benefit of pilgrims, but rather tourists, who of course have a tendency to come in from very different reasons and may bring a different economic market with them. Of course, tourists are the reasons why these sites are still maintained as national icons. The identity is not simply religious, but economic. And these Instagrammers are taking full advantage of the backdrops thus provided by their 14th century forebears. What we are seeing here as well is a problem for heritage. For whom are these sites preserved, and for whom do we invest in their restoration and conservation over time? Should we necessarily restore a building or simply bring it to a state where it is sustainable in the condition it's in historically? Because remembering that the necropolis is a living city, and the living city is very much for the community around the Shah-i-Zinda today, not those tourists who come from even further away. So what we are seeing here, of course, is a fundamental question of exactly for whom our history is told. That brings us to the Mazar-i-Sharif, a grave of the saints, which in this case has given its name to the entire city in which it is situated in northwest Afghanistan. The story begins, in fact, with the journey of a white camel. as all good stories should. But in this case, the story of Ali bin Abi Talib, he was a son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, and he was assassinated. Knowing that his body would be subject to political machinations, either found and destroyed or disparaged or venerated, depending on who was to keep it, he decided to let no one have access to his body. After his assassination, his instructions were to have his body tied to a white camel who would be exiled into the desert. And as a result of this, no one would thus know where his body ended up, or the camel for that matter. But a scholar, many years later, dreamt that his bones were interred on this particular piece of land. And subsequently, Ahmad Sanjah, a Seljuk sultan, constructed the shrine of Ali there. This created the new city around the grave of the saint. Until Genghis Khan visited in 1220. Genghis Khan destroyed the city and the site and killed many, many people in this process. And it wasn't until the site was rebuilt in 1481 that the site we see today, including the famous Blue Mosque, was constructed. And of course, over time, many amendments happened to this site. But I think it's also important to remember that this being a living community, Mazar-i Sharif is also internationally famous for an event in 1998, a massacre of the Hazari people by the Taliban, in which some 8,000 people were killed. So when we are looking at these sites, it is important not only to remember how beautiful they are and the exquisite productions of cultural heritage and the difficulties in sustaining these, but what these living communities experience as elements that shape their identity to this day. And of course, being a living community, it is very much an active social space. The gatherings you are seeing here are not necessarily tourists, but locals to the city of Mazar-i Sharif, who meet around the site of the shrines of the saint as a convivial social space, a place to meet one's lovers, family, friends, business partners. It is an element of the life of the city, not simply a city of the dead. And of course, exquisite from all angles. You will notice that this being approached from any number of sides means all external sides are decorated. And you will also note, if you look very carefully, that there are multiple buildings in this complex, like the Shah-i-Zinda. The site of which is the grave of the saint is a separate building to the Blue Mosque, which shares elements of decoration over time. Here is the differentiation. Behind that tree, we see the Blue Mosque, differentiated from the shrines of the saints by the presence of the minarets that rise as high towers on the corners of this particular structure. When we are looking at these, we can also see iwans, which are like porticos, that is to say, a kind of balcony veranda, depending on the second or first level, where you have an opening to the external space. These iwans are significant, and we'll see a few more of them in future slides. But as we hone in, just take a moment to see what patterns we can find here. Repeat tessellations. If you look very carefully, here's a little quiz for you. Are these cut tiles or haft rangi tessellations? Here's the hint. Look for the grid, haft rangi. Each one is a square or rectangle or curved form, which has been painted on a more complex pattern. Thus, the complexity is held within the glazing, not the cutting of the tiles. But while you were looking at that pattern, did you notice anything a bit odd about this layout? Anything that would cause it to not win first prize at a quilt show? Well, let's have a careful look at this. I've done it for you. Maybe you spotted others, but these are what I spotted. When we look at these inconsistencies in tile alignment, we are reminded that this is normal. This is not necessarily the result of someone who wasn't appropriately restoring. Rather, they're working with the tiles they have at the time. And there is a sense of, such a complex pattern, maybe this won't be noticed. Truly, in best practice, you might be careful to avoid these. But the realities of the world are such that public spaces are not necessarily best practice. Even World Heritage Conservation sites have to recognize the efforts of previous generations of restoration. And when we are looking at these forms, we are being reminded that our mistakes are certainly part of what we make. So when we interpret these in cross-stitch, don't worry if it goes in a different direction. No one looks at the back. So moving from this, As we look more carefully at these works, I just wanted to shout out to some wonderful work we've seen by Yumiko Seke, The Reflection from the Blue Mosque, which I'll leave long enough for you to find the original tiles on the screen. But noticing as well how carefully these have been observed to create a respectful homage to the original form, knowing that this is a translation, not a replica, but a new artwork created with reference to something that came before. And of course, Lynn Angus's Blue Star, looking more carefully towards the geometric relationships and the very fine configuration and proportions of the original tiles, which of course came from different generations and applied to the same building. One of the most important things to remember about all of these sites is they were not made in one night. They were built over centuries and restored over centuries, each time bringing new voices to the hands that made the building. I mentioned earlier the problem of over-restoration and Instagram restoration, where you make it to look really good in photographs as opposed to being respectful to what is known on the site and the historical value of the site. This is an example, I think, of a more sustained ruin, where they're looking to preserve the site at the Masjid Sabz, the green mosque. Masjid, of course, is the Arabic word for mosque. And mosque is technically kind of an English word in this respect. Masjid is more accurate. So when we are looking at this, the Green Mosque in Balkh, Afghanistan, we are seeing the Iwan of the opening space before the doorway. We are seeing the secondary Iwans to the side and the ruins of what would have been a much higher set of minarets and the dome just peeking out over the top. And as we are looking at all of these things, I'm going to transport you to another site hundreds of kilometers away to the west in Iran. Hold your eyes on the screen. Doesn't it look similar? As we are looking at this transition from one to the other, in case you were drinking a cup of tea and missed it, I'll do it again. Back to the Green Mosque, and now to the Jama Masjid. What we are seeing here is one of the most extraordinary sites in the history of Islamic art and architecture, because it is a site that compounds about 1,000 years of cultural innovation and technological development and urban design principles. The Jama Masjid is a site that was here presented to us in 1867 by Pascal Conte, and today looks like this. It is an accumulation of different rulers working from a courtly principle. Here we are not dealing with a relatively provincial governor who is restoring a particular site. We are dealing with the heart of an empire in Isfahan. We are looking at a space that was designed for political and religious reasons, bringing together enormous congregational crowds. Remembering that Jama is also translatable as a Friday mosque, a congregational mosque for big gatherings, not your smaller scale local community center, but rather the kind of grand monument that we see in capital cities to this day. The first mosque on the site no longer exists, but it was thought to have started in 1771. That is very early in terms of the history of Islam. And the first surviving structure, which contributes to the building which is there now, originated around 1070. So what we are seeing here is a continuous accumulation over time. And if you look very carefully, we can see political propaganda appearing on the posters here as well. It would not have been unusual for a ruler to establish new sections or improved tile work, for example, to any given part of this mosque, making their mark on this site. And now we are honing in on that Iwan we saw earlier, the southern Iwan, one of the more magnificent, noting that there are at least 3 major Iwan on this area, each one being contributed by a different dynasty over time. It may remind us of the format of the Registan complex in Samarkand, and that is no coincidence. This is a gathering and a creating a public space between more pivotal areas, focus points for the visitor. And of course, just pausing on how complex this is, you are seeing Tuluth calligraphy with the extended vertical lines to the highest point of the skyline, continuing further down with arabesque or Islami formats, and then cartouche-like epigrammic inscriptions from the Quran and reiterating important phrases. These would almost certainly be text from the Quran, because to be positioned that high on the building, you are looking for a statement of particular significance to its religious purpose. You would find recognition for the person who commissioned it much lower and closer to the ground. Just pause for a moment and take this in. and be happy that none of us are trying to create a complete life-scale form interpretations of this in needlepoint. What we are looking at here, of course, is a recognition of the texture and topography of these tiles, noting that they interact with brick as a scaffolding and a framework, but they are also elevated, inset, and otherwise working with negative space. When we are looking at the complexity of forms, we are reminded of the geometric principles of infinite extension of any given point. And of course, geometric principles and best practice design are a thing we could focus on for a different lecture. As we are looking at these again, Maureen Hopp created this wonderful lily in paradise, evoking the tile work of the Jama Masjid, which of course is a complex site with many other sections beyond the Iran we've just seen. So wonderful variation in color here, Maureen, absolutely gorgeous work. Pascal Conte and the other European Orientalists traveled to these sites to record the complex visual grammar of this ornament, presenting a grid-like and symmetrical formation which overlooks some elements of detail. For example, in this study, if we look at the base of that minaret, the tower from which the muezzin would call Muslims to prayer, if we look at the base, it's slightly different on the original. And indeed, what Pascal Conte did not record was the meaning of the square Kufic calligraphy. What he saw was a pattern people who read Arabic and Persian would see as words. So what we are seeing here as well is the complex mukhanas that are used to elevate the scaffolding structure underneath the podium of the minaret, in this case accompanied by wood carving and other elements to enable the person to stand upon here and call out above the city in an era before microphone application. You will also notice here the text written in brickwork, the square Kufic. This is technically called Banai technique, and you will find it across the Persianate world, including in parts of Cairo and other cities where Persian travelers made their presence felt by reference to new design innovations. Now, we've been focusing on ceramic tiles quite a bit in this lecture, but in practice, we have some other very different things to work with. These are stucco patterns evoked from the Iljaiho Mihrab from the Ilkhanid period in the same Jame Mosque, an earlier part of the mosque overall. What we are seeing here is the idea of those visual forms that find their way onto tiles, but using a method that doesn't require color. As we look very carefully into this, we can find the elements of calligraphy and the floriate forms, which are themselves quoted from earlier periods in the visual design of this movement. The mihrab, by the way, is an extremely important structure within every mosque in the world. The mihrab is the point at which you are indicating the direction of Mecca. It is an orientation device. And this aligns to the Kaaba, specifically in Mecca, which is the giant black cube in the middle of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. But the mihrab takes a variety of forms, extremely different depending on where you are in the world. But they're meant to be universally recognizable and are often one of the most highly decorated parts within the interior of a mosque. Next to it, we also have two minbar, which are like stairways leading up to a seat. The way the minbar is used is that an imam, who is like the congregational leader who runs the prayer initially, will stand not at the very top. That space is reserved for the Prophet Muhammad should he return to earth. Instead, the imam will stand somewhere medium height or thereabouts and lead the prayer from that space. The conspicuous absence here is important. But back to the mihrab. We can see here the relationship between the ceramics and the previous stucco work, that they are expanding upon a similar visual dynamic, a grammar of ornament. Indeed, the text may be very similar from one to the next. But here, in this extraordinary ceramic mihrab, we are looking at an artifact which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. How did it end up there? I wouldn't say it was stolen, it was purchased. We have a provenance that goes back quite a long way for this one. But why were they selling it to begin with? It seems like a rather conspicuous thing to remove from a major mosque. What we are seeing is actually adaptation from a madrasa, a school, rather than a public site at the same time. Political reasons can give a different focus for certain buildings being restored and others being taken apart. But here I just wanted to evoke the idea that the tiles in some ways can be moved Other architectural features are more fragile and don't travel as well. Let's hone in on one detail of this stucco mihrab. This is just a pause for you to say, wow. As we are looking at these movements, you will see shapes and evocations that we also found in the Shah-i-Zinda. We have shapes that don't necessarily have easy words to describe in English. For example, if we look very carefully, I don't know if you can see my cursor right now, Natalie. Very good. We have a three-lobed format over here, which the Egyptian tent makers call an arus, the bride. And the referencing for this being called the arus, or the bride, has a number of different points of origin, but it is a three-lobed format that we see frequently across Islamic visual cultures, and Arabic and Persian visual cultures separate to being Islamic. Moving from here, more text from the Quran within the center of the mihrab, just indicating the complexity of this form. These are not tiles. This is a single structure carved from a single object. So when we are looking at this, we can see how the tiles became an expediency, a method by which you could shape something in a site quite some distance potentially from the site where it would then be installed. So we can see a reasoning for why stucco gave way to ceramic over time. But that brings us, I think, now to the last of our elements, the Taj Mahal. I want to make sure there's time for questions, so I'm going to accelerate a little bit. And last time I spoke, several people thanked me for using some poetry, the Cargoes poem by John Masefield, which I used as a metaphor of the Silk Road as traveling goods over time and place. I have two different poems for us today regarding the Taj Mahal. Rabindranath Tagore, an extraordinary figure within Indian and the poetry of the subcontinent extended, wrote of this: "You knew, Shah Jahan, life and youth, wealth and glory. They all drift away in the current of time. You strove, therefore, to perpetuate only the sorrow of your heart. Let the splendor of diamond, pearl, and ruby vanish, like the magic shimmer of the rainbow. Only let this one teardrop, this Taj Mahal, glisten spotlessly bright on the cheek of time, forever and ever." And as we are looking at this extraordinary structure, we are reminded as well that this is a translation into English from the original languages in which it was written. Like the work we are doing in needlepoint, it is not the same, but it is something new in translation. And as we think about this, the Taj Mahal as a teardrop on the cheek of time. Oh, hello, my wife's just arrived from a week away. Hello, Melinda. But back to this, because Melinda and I have some stories about the Taj Mahal. Now, back to this. Of course, it's fair that you get to see the whole thing, this teardrop on the cheek of time, one of the most extraordinary examples of opulence in the history of humanity. A mausoleum dedicated to the most loved of the wives of Shah Jahan, created for her after she died in childbirth of her 14th child. Extraordinary. And what we are seeing in this too was the manifestation of not only imperial power, but an economic structure that used an extraordinary amount of state financial resources in the time it was made to create something which has lasted immensely over time. Let's think about this design, shall we? It is the first time we've seen a white structure in this way, this ostentatious use of marble as an exterior covering, not ceramic either. There is, in fact, no meaningful use of ceramic on this site. It is cut stone inlay, much harder, much more durable, and more expensive to work with per square inch. It is also a complex, like the Shah-i-Zinda, but allowing no one else to modify or interfere with this grand vision of an individual's profession of love for someone else, this great romantic statement. What we are seeing here is something I alluded to earlier, the Shandi Bar format of the square garden, which is a square format garden. We can see the central line created by the fountains and pools, which evokes again to a square format overall, hidden somewhat by the trees at the sides, but it is also a walled garden. Paradise was cited to be a walled garden, an enclosed space separate from the world, which is more perfect than the rest of the world. What we are also seeing on this site is that elevation of the Taj Mahal itself on a higher foundation, partly to allow for floods, but also symbolically differentiated from the ground of the garden itself, as a mausoleum would. What we are also seeing in this scene, however, is that second half, the famous supposed legend of the second Taj Mahal being originally designed for Shah Jahan himself in black stone, something of a legend not necessarily thought to be true. But Shah Jahan is, of course, interred inside the Taj Mahal next to his beloved wife. This is the way I was able to see the Taj Mahal many years ago, at sunset, just as Shah Jahan wanted you to see it. But when we are looking at this site, I'm also reminded that when my wife and I were there, I was going to propose to her at this site, but she kept wandering away and I couldn't find her in the crowd. So that put that off for a couple of years. But what we are seeing here as well is a small reminder of the human figure in these spaces. Note how tiny we look against the majesty of this extraordinary site. It is significantly larger than any of the buildings in the Shah-i-Zinda by a very large margin. But these figures walking as they do at a certain height create a dynamic blurring or shimmering line, which is constantly moving around these sites. So the building has a sort of floating appearance when the crowds gather around it. You will also note that that long fountain in the gardens is designed to give a continuous, uninterrupted line of sight to the structure. So the fountain is there to prevent people from standing in that particular site, thus giving you this perfection of a built environment. But the Taj Mahal has its own quotes and references. It was inspired by the layout and design of Humayun's tomb from 1562. And Humayun's tomb itself was a reference to the Gur-Imamiyya in Samarkand, very close to where Shah-i-Zinda is, which was the tomb of Tamerlane or Timur. And I recall vividly the inscription written on this tomb: "If anyone pillages this site, it will awaken a conqueror worse than I." And isn't that just badass, really? Said to be a bit of a legend as a statement, but what a wonderful thing to write on one's own grave. When we are looking at this too, I mentioned Kshatris as being a key differentiation from the Gur-Imamiyya. What is a Kshatri, you may well ask? This is a Kshatri. Now, a Kshatri is an elevated stone pavilion modeled on a form of tomb covering, more distinctive within Hinduism than Islam. It is a regional element of Indian presence in architecture. In the way that I mentioned earlier, Mukhanas is distinctive to Arabic and Persianate cultures. The Kshatri is distinctive to the subcontinent. So finding these included on the Taj Mahal elevated and the Tomb of Humayun are quite distinctive visual elements. You will see here they are presented in stone. The earliest forms of Kshatri were probably wood and textile. And we can see these preserved in Persian painting, what used to be called miniatures, but really they're paintings. They fit on a page format, that's why they're small. But moving from here, the Kshatris are an important element of the innovation of the Taj Mahal, but we are here not for the ceramic this time, but the inlaid stonework, known as pietra dura in Italian, or more locally, pacincari. Because remember, all of these craftsmen use their own words for these innovations. The pacincari system is thought to be linked to Italianate systems as well, where Venetians in particular were known for working with inlaid stonework. And this was used in household furniture, in artwork, in architecture, and churches to a variable extent. But the key thing about the Taj Mahal's use of this pacincari method was the value of the stones themselves, separate to the craftsmanship. You are embedding them within marble. We are using semi-precious and even precious stones like jasper, serpentine, green porphyry, mother of pearl inlaid work, and lapis lazuli, that rich dark blue we are seeing here. And just a reminder for where these evocations are being taken from. Oh, pardon me, it moved by itself. We saw this earlier, the Western Iwan of the Masjid Jame in Isfahan. And the idea here is we are seeing in ceramic what Shah Jahan was commissioning in stone. And here is a detail from the patterns of the Taj Mahal, noticing that the nature of the stone itself speaks to different textures and complexity. It interacts with light differently to ceramic, and it feels different underfoot or underhand. When we are looking at these forms, we are seeing evocations of complexity, which are being quoted by many other people over time, which we will see in our third lecture of this series. And of course, the studies of the Pietra stonework have found their way into museums around the world, and they are still being made by craftsmen in the Agra region to this day. So what we are seeing here are the use of floriated decoration evolving from stucco and manuscript inks into forms that are distinctive to India, referencing local flora, referencing flora from different regions of the world, images that have their own meaning separate to what they are apparently depicting. And of course, the wonderful work that we are seeing by our own stitchers as part of the Silk Inroads project, where we are looking to these forms and translating them in the way that makes sense to our eyes. We are respecting the original work and making new work in homage to this. And I just wanted to note this particularly extraordinary work by Joan Innes, pardon me, who not only sewed this with a variety of subtle hues to evoke the complexity of marble, but in this case added beadwork to it, which I think is very much in the style of the Taj Mahal itself, being an ostentatious and more than necessary sight. But this brings us to another point. The ostentatiousness of the Taj Mahal, and I think Melinda's looking over my shoulder now, so she might remember this site too. We are now looking within the interior of the site. This is actually at the second story, looking out over the gardens from above. You will see this consistent work of constant elaborate ornamentation and niches for lamps and other objects in this space. But unfortunately, and of course the most important element of all, the actual tomb of the interned individuals. You will see that Shah Jahan's mausoleum, in this case, the structure to the back, is slightly larger and awkwardly placed in an otherwise symmetrical area. His is asymmetrical because he wasn't technically supposed to be interned here. He died before his own structure was finished, but this was appropriate for his wishes. The very sad truth I'm about to bestow on you all now is something that Melinda learned to her shock, I think might be the right word here, which is despite the beauty of this space, walking through it smells like old socks. Yes, you probably didn't expect to know that the Taj Mahal is not a pleasant smell inside on account of millions of visitors every year, moving through this space fresh after taking their shoes off, leaving their socks on within the building itself. There's no air conditioning in the Taj Mahal. Why would there be? So when we are considering this, just a little oral consideration that you may not have noticed unless you've been there. Now, of course, where does the Taj Mahal sit in modernity? It is a powerful symbol of India. It has also been taken and contested as a symbol of Hindu nationalism, of the presence of Islamic architecture in the subcontinent, as an extraordinary site for envisioning the complexities of India's diverse populations by a unifying point of history, the actions of Shah Jahan. What we are seeing here, of course, is a work by Steve McCurry, which I think embodies some of this contradiction between modernity and the memory of the Taj Mahal as a space that tries to be separate from humanity and our ordinary lives. And I think this is very well captured by this poem and this photograph as well. The poem is from a 1963 Urdu poem by the writer Sahir Ludhiani, which actually was written for a Bollywood film. As we are thinking about this, he wrote his poems to be lyrical first rather than musically driven. He wanted the lyrics to drive the story of the movie. And in this case, this translation by Riz Rahim, I think, captures this very well. These mausoleums, these arrogant forts, these pillars of royal eminence, these lush gardens, in these very flowers and vines runs the blood of our ancestors, my love. Don't you think they must also have been in love, the people whose art and skill made this monument so beautiful? They and their loved ones now lie nameless in unmarked graves, without a single candle yet lit for them. These gardens by the Jumana, this palace, the embroidered doors, walls, and niches, that's just how an emperor, using his wealth and power, mocks the love between us, poor people. Could we meet somewhere else, darling? And on that note, we will meet somewhere else. We have our third and final lecture for this series of Silk Inroads on creative translation in contemporary art. This will be a lecture where we'll talk about the work we've made together in this space and the precedents that other artists have used to look to craft, to history, to their own individual identity and the practices of other people to create new statements that build on all the work that has gone before. Thank you. There we go. So I guess that now brings us over to questions if we have time. It is now 5 minutes to, not many questions, sorry, but over to you. Does anyone have a question? You can raise your hand.
Yes, raise your hand. There's nothing in the chat box at present. So would anyone like to ask a question directly to Sam at this point?
Just wiggle your hand so we can see. We can then unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. If you're overwhelmed, that's okay too. Oh, hello, Masood. Yes, Masood. Good to see you from joining us from New Zealand.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm not quite sure of the background of the Inroad Silk Road. What was the incentive of, having this activity?
That's well explained in the book Gauza by Natalie Fisher, but Natalie Fisher is an artist who has developed this project from her own work in needlepoint previously. Natalie, would you like to speak to this?
Yes, I would. Thank you for the question. I've been inspired by the Silk Roads architecture and tile work for a number of years and interpreted it in my own work. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to have something a bit broader than just me and my work and involve a larger community. And because Wagga Wagga in New South Wales is such a multicultural city, and it's been a welcome city for refugees for people from many Silk Roads countries for many years, I applied for a government grant, received some funding to work with the local community to create a more collaborative project and involve more people in this process. And that's how it came about.
Does that answer your question, Masood?
Thank you very much.
Very good. Very good. Any other questions, please?
You'll need to unmute yourselves if you would like to ask anything of Sam. Sam, while they're doing that, I have a quick question for you. Earlier, when you mentioned in the Shah-i-Zinda, in particular, how a lot of the work there, the ceramic tile work has been restored for tourists. When I was there, I also noticed that there were many locals using the space, which was really great to see. What's your view on whether sites should be left at a sustainable stage or whether they should be restored? Do you have a view on that?
I think there's a view, my view is there's a fine line between Disneyfication and respectful use of the site. And Disneyfication is a problem where we can see extensions to a site that were not supported by any historical understanding of the site, be it living memory or a written source before that. But there are also limitations. For example, I know that when the Street of the Tent Makers in Cairo was restored to a extent where the building was functional and no longer leaking, for example, they also did not include any electricity power points. So there's no artificial lighting or other systems to include electricity powered objects. And this was a severe limitation to the use of some of the upstairs rooms, the workrooms and so on in that area. So there is a point of balance, I think, between the over-restoration and the idea of recognizing the historical precedent of that site. The other examples here I can think of would be sites like access to Uluru in Australia, for example, where recognizing the historical value is quite different from what tourists' demand of the site might be. And trying to find the compromise between the two is an ongoing tension between any historical site. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the chat box.
There is a question in the chat box. Can you see it, Sam? Or do you want
I can, from Alison. Thank you very much for asking. Which, if any, of these architectural features are used in new builds of mosques, mausoleums, or other Islamic buildings today, particularly in Australia? To my knowledge, I don't think there are any mausolea in Australia of an Islamic form, but there are for other people. But the ones you're looking at particularly would be references to domes and muqarnas and variations on the idea of minarets. I've actually written an article on this, it might be useful for you. In The Conversation, I wrote a piece called Friday Essay, The Australian Mosque. And in that I go through, identify a number of key features of earlier historical styles, which are still present today. Notably, for example, Turkish forms in mosques in Western Sydney, referencing Ottoman architects like Selim the Great and so on. and when we are looking at Suleymania, pardon me, when we are looking at these forms, we are seeing different regional focuses. Today, however, in the most recent mosques, we don't often see historical quotation. We see adaptation. For example, in the Punch Bowl Mosque in Sydney, there are a number of Mulcanis-inspired subdomes. They're not true Mulcanis, they're a little convex or concave, pardon me, element, which ducks into a concrete larger dome. But each one of them has written in golden calligraphy one of the 99 names of Allah. So these are actually quite new designs, but they evoke older forms, but they don't really quote them. So thank you, Alison, for that question. And I think now we're running out of time, but I'll answer one more if you have any more.
Yep. I can't see anything else in the chat box. Would anyone else like to ask a question directly of Sam for the last minute?
If not, in that case, thank you all for your time.
Sam,
I hope you enjoyed this presentation.
I certainly enjoyed it, Sam. I'm sure everyone did as well. And I would like to thank you once again for a wonderful presentation. It just really brings our project alive. And it's so valuable to have you here as part of this. And so thank you very much once again. And I thank everyone for coming along. And for those of you joining us on Zoom for the next lecture, we'll be live streaming from the Art Gallery on Saturday, the 5th of March. At 1 p.m. And for those of you in or near Wagga, come along to the Art Gallery, to the E3 Art Space, and you can join us in person. So thank you once again, Sam. Thanks for coming along, everyone, and see you all soon.
Thank you, Sam.